Rain kept time against the panes of the Sterling house, a steady, indifferent percussion that sounded like a clock, counting not minutes, but missed chances. The mansion had been built to impress the world. High columns, polished floors, portraits that watched with polite eyes. But tonight, it answered the weather with the small sounds of a house growing older, the sigh of settling beams, the soft creak of leather in a favorite chair, the faint rasp of breath from the man who sat in it. Arthur Sterling had run companies, closed deals, and kept his name in lights. He had learned how to read the angles of people, the way a hand reached for a glass, the way a smile arrived when money was mentioned. But the skill that had served him for decades no longer comforted him. Years of being taken for advantage, a few betrayals that stung longer than they had any right to, had built a wall inside him. When men he considered family had turned to counting plates rather than listening to words, that wall had become his companion. Now it sheltered him like a coat, and he wore that coat willingly. His face looked smaller in the dim firelight, the shadow of a once angular jaw softened by fatigue. His eyes, still sharp enough to notice the way a servant straightened a picture frame, had lost the easy warmth they once offered. They were the eyes of a man who had learned to expect the worst. On the side table was an envelope, deliberately placed. It lay there like a small sun, discreet and obvious at once. Cream paper, the flap tucked, the corner of a banknote just visible where Arthur had asked the assistant to arrange it so it could be seen without being handled. It was a stone made into bait. Arthur had not chosen this test lightly. He had thought it through as one thinks of difficult medicine, necessary, prescribed, bitter. He had been betrayed in ways that mattered, a partner who had siphoned funds under the guise of friendship, a trusted manager who had put profit above people, a marriage arrangement that had left scars disguised as civility. Most wounding had been the slow understanding that some around him prized his name and his house more than the man in the chair. He wanted to know, finally, who loved him and who loved the ledger. He had rehearsed his lines with Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper who had kept the place together since his wife's funeral. Her hands had fed him soup when he wouldn't remember to eat. She moved now with soft confidence, deciding which lamp to light, smoothing a throw that had long outlived its usefulness. She had her doubts about the plan. She had been with Arthur the longest, longer than his marriages, longer than his titles, and she loved him in a way that could only be described as practical, bringing socks, mending hems, carrying the weight of having watched his decline. But she also understood the hunger inside him, how suspicion had become his nightly companion. "Be gentle," she had said the first time Arthur told her. There was no scolding in her voice, only the flatness of someone who had watched good intentions become sharp with neglect. Arthur had promised gentleness. They had set the scene with a subtle cruelty that felt to him like a surgeon's hand. He would make himself poor and feeble. He would hide the comfort of his life so the truth could be revealed. He would wait in the dim light of his study and see which of his children came to him as a man and which came for the house. It was late afternoon when the first car cut a path through the rain-slick driveway. The oldest son arrived with the kind of presence that wanted to assert itself before the door closed. A tailored coat, a watch that flashed where a wrist met cuff, a stride made to be noticed. Henry Sterling carried the certainty of someone who had been trained to fix things by spending money. His greeting was efficient, full of subtext. He kissed the air near his father's cheek, and then, without meaning to be rude, asked about the estate in the same breath. "Anything I should sign?" he asked, as if sentiment and business could be neatly parsed into separate rooms. His voice was polished. He had been good at making practical questions sound like affection. Next came Mark, the middle son, who walked in with a different kind of economy, a practiced casualness, a laugh that landed where caution should have been. Mark believed in comfort and the transpose of comfort. He believed in being comfortable and ensuring others admired the comfort he upheld. He nodded to Mrs. Higgins, allowed the house to hug him briefly, and then began talking about what needed updating, what could be streamlined, what could bring in better returns. His words were full of spreadsheets, not memories. The youngest, Ethan, came last. Ethan had not arrived in a flashy car or with a lawyer at his elbow. He had walked in with rain on his shoulders and a jacket that had seen better years, its collar worn soft where his chin rubbed it during long drives years ago. Ethan's hands found his father's hand before he asked how he was,
and he held it like a small, steady anchor. His coat smelled faintly of smoke and the river down by his boyhood bridge. He had been the one who took the extra shifts at the repair shop, the one who fixed dumpsters when they stuck, and friends' roofs when winter hammered them. He kept a small wooden airplane in the pocket of his jacket, a child's thing repaired a dozen times, the kind of object people think belongs to a past rather than being carried like an unlit lamp. Each son carried his own truth into the house. They were not villains. They were men made by the same father but sprung from different soils. Henry wanted assurance that his father's name would not become a liability. Mark wanted the freedom to keep his life spinning without extra friction. Ethan wanted to sit close, hear the echo of a laugh that had been rare of late, and know that his father was not alone.
They found Arthur like actors stepping onto a set. He lay in the chair, shawl across his knees, though the fire made a smile possible for anyone with enough warmth. He had asked to be left alone, and the sons obliged at first, standing at polite distances, talking about the weather, about how the rain had stalled flights, a gulf of things easier to say than what truly mattered. The envelope sat where Arthur had placed it. It was a visual suggestion more than a demand. Its presence created small currents in the room, a pause here, a glance there, a worn hand uncurling before it settled again. People noticed what the world presented. That was not a sin. It was human. Henry had been the first to let his eyes linger on the edge of the envelope. He smiled for a moment that suggested humor. Always dramatic, father. But the borrowed mood faded when he realized it was less theatrics than a setup. He reached for the envelope with a deliberation that betrayed calculation more than impulse. His fingers brushed the flap. For the smallest of seconds, he imagined the freedom a check could buy. His expression tightened, and then, with an almost imperceptible shake of his head, he let it be. Mark reacted differently. He thought aloud, more for his own reassurance than for any listener. We should look into consolidating. There's a lot of dead capital sitting here. Dad, you know I can set... He stopped when he saw Arthur's face. The conversation had skidded from strategy into the human, and like most of them, he felt the discomfort of a child stepping into a room of old, unyielding pain. Ethan came forward without measurement. He remembered the jacket. He remembered, too, that small wooden airplane, the way his father had carved its nose with a pocket knife the year Ethan had fallen off his bicycle and cried until the moon came down to listen. He thought of those afternoons standing on the dock, Arthur's voice teaching him how to tie a knot, how to be patient with a reel that snagged. Those memories were currency to him, but not the sort the others counted. Ethan reached out, not to the envelope, but to the blanket across his father's knees. The room smelled of rain and burnt toast and soap. The air held an expectation of something unspoken. Mrs. Higgins watched the sons as she had watched many scenes in that house. She recognized the flickers of old patterns. Henry scanning, Mark's parlor of plans, Ethan centering. Her hands smoothed a cushion. She placed a kettle on the stove, allowing the steam to edge the room with something domestic and ordinary. Arthur measured them from his chair. His test was not only a device to expose greed, it was a mirror, a way to see whether his sons had learned what he hoped to have taught them. He wanted to be surprised, yes, but he also wanted to be forgiven. He feared, beneath the stone of his cynicism, that he had created in his boys the practicalities he prized, ambition, a nose for business, but that he had not taught them how to be small and kind, how to sit amid quiet suffering and not be distracted. The rain drummed harder, as if the weather too wanted to know the outcome. Conversations became smaller. Henry spoke about closing times, about a trust. Mark kept bringing the dialogue round to expenses. Ethan asked a question that landed like a pebble in a shallow pond. "Do you remember when we used to sit up and listen to Mum read?" His voice was not a demand. It was a key turned softly. Arthur's face moved at the memory. It cracked, more than a smile, less than a sob. There was a picture of a woman smiling at the stove, flour on her cheek, a domesticity that had cost them nothing and given them everything. The house held that memory in ways no ledger ever could. The moment Arthur wanted came not because the envelope moved, but because the room cultivated small reveals. Henry rose, saying he had to step to a meeting. Mark made a plan and took a call. They were not cruel. They simply moved with lives that demanded their attention. The test, Arthur reminded himself, was not their schedules but their hearts. He looked at Ethan. Ethan sat forward, his jacket damp at the shoulders. He took the wooden airplane from his pocket and turned it between his fingers, smoothing the scuffs with a thumb as if he might make them disappear. He watched his father with attention that was more medicine than speech. He did not glance at the envelope.
He did not tally the house in silent ledgers. He was present. Presence, Arthur recognized, was rarer than prosperity. Then the staged temptation increased. Arthur had told the assistant to leave the envelope a little closer, to leave the room for a few minutes with a plausible excuse, to see what would happen when a man appeared vulnerable and a temptation sat in clear sight. He asked for the chandelier to dim, for the fire to be allowed to burn low. The light bent the room into gentleness. Arthur allowed himself the weakness it required. He arranged a cough that sounded thin and fragile. His hands brushed the arm of the chair as if reaching for something. He did not shout. He did not invoke theatrics. He settled into the performance of a man who might be alone and who might, by the world's measure, be poor. It was an odd sensation, to be poor by pretending you could not be. It felt dishonest and honest at once, like a confession pretending not to be a confession. Aloneness requires demonstration if it is to be tested. To ask whether his sons would come out of obligation or out of love, he had to be undone enough that the distinction would be drawn. Henry smoothed his cuff and went to the window, watching rain like a man measuring opportunities. Mark, checking his phone, said he would call a broker and handle it after he took care of a few things.
They arranged logistics, not comfort. They used language that kept a son at a distance and a customer close at hand. Ethan, having put the airplane back in his pocket, approached his father's chair. He saw the envelope on the table, and something flickered across his face. Curiosity, yes, but then something that eclipsed it. A recognition that this was a man who might need warmth more than he needed money. He reached for the blanket that lay across Arthur's knees, and, without ceremony, took the jacket off his shoulders. It was not new. It had patches in the elbows, a mended seam near the hem. But it carried the smell of the river and of the years he'd worked. It carried the smallness of a life that had held its own worth. Ethan laid the jacket over Arthur, tucking it about his father's shoulders, as if the action were both apology and prayer. The wood airplane slid from his pocket in the movement and landed on the rug. Ethan did not retrieve it. He did not count its loss. He had given the jacket because it mattered more to him to keep the man warm than it mattered to him to keep something he had loved close. The room folded in on that act. It was a small thing, no grand speech, no public display, but it had weight. Henry stopped at the window. Mark made a half-hearted apology to his phone. Mrs. Higgins' breath caught somewhere deep. Arthur felt the jacket settle on him like a hand. Something in him shifted, something like a thaw, like a small stone dislodging in a dam. He had asked for proof, and proof had arrived not as a ledger entry or a signed document, but as a simple, selfless movement. He felt all at once the gulf between the men who thought he would teach them business and the man who had taught a boy to tie a knot and to hold steady in the rain. He was careful, trained by years, not to let his face betray him. He had learned how to keep feeling private. But his throat closed. He had not prepared for the ache that came with recognition. He felt absurdly as if the jacket had reminded him of a winter years ago when a child had shivered on the dock and a hand had offered warmth without a ledger. Ethan sat on the arm of the chair, fingers curled around the plane now on the floor. His eyes were steady on his father's face. He did not ask for anything. He offered himself. It was not the kind of nobility that cleansed the world. It was the daily kind, the kind measured in minutes and missed comforts, an act of loyalty disguised as a small domesticity. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, silence drew a careful circle around them. Arthur's breath had come quicker. Henry finally turned from the window and crossed to his father's side, a guarded expression softening when he saw the jacket. He reached out, almost to touch his father's shoulder, then hesitated, uncertain whether this was now a moment to grieve or to calculate. Mark abandoned his call and stood in the doorway, caught between business and a scene that did not pay dividends. "You always did things your own way," Arthur said, his voice thin but clear. It was not accusation, it was a note of astonishment and surrender. He had made a plan to unmask, and yet he found himself unmasked by a boy's simple warmth. Ethan smiled without grandness. "You kept the best advice for last," he said softly, fingers still curled around the plane, "and the worst jokes." It drew a breathier chuckle from Arthur, a small sound that felt like the fracture of a dam. He had taught his sons to be practical. He had not always taught them how to be present. That was his fault, he understood, a truth he had to accept before he asked for forgiveness. For a beat, everything in the room held. The envelope sat forgotten, a sun dimmed by cloud. The sons alternated between looking at Arthur and at one another.
seeing the reality of age laid out like a map they had not studied. There were no villains here, and there were no saints. There were simply men with different languages for love. Arthur allowed himself something risky. "Why did you come, Ethan?" he asked, not to trap, but to understand. He needed categorization only because suspicion had taught him to do so. He sought to be remedied by explanation. Ethan looked at him like a man looking at a patient he would not abandon. "Because it's you," he said. "Because I remember when you showed me how to knot things so they'd hold. Because you taught me how to fix a broken board instead of buying a new one. Because none of that needs a balance sheet." The words landed without flourish. They were not crafted to appeal to Arthur's vanity or to manipulate. They were the sort of words that come from someone who has measured life in action more than in accounting. They were sincere and therefore dangerous to a man like Arthur, who had learned to protect himself from sincere things. Arthur's chest felt tight, a constriction that was not simply physical. He had wanted proof, and Ethan had given him a proof that could not be filed away. He had long believed that to guard himself from disappointment, he needed to control everything. Now, in this small, ordinary gesture, he felt the desirous, fragile thing he had hoped to find, an unbought, unsold piece of care. There was a moment then when two possible roads opened before him. One would be to let suspicion win, to see this warmth as a population of feelings to be managed and rationed. The other would be to let himself be touched, and perhaps to risk the vulnerability that followed. Both roads carried consequences. Both would shape how the rest of the house would breathe. Arthur, an old hunter of motives, felt the wall inside him crack. Not in a flash, no cinematic collapse. Rather, a thin fissure like a hairline fracture through years of stone. He had come here planning to expose hearts. Instead, his own heart was being exposed by a boy who had been given less and given more in equal measure. Outside, thunder shook a window pane.
Inside, the quiet deepened as if the house were listening. Mrs. Higgins cleared her throat and set down a cup of tea, hands steady, though her eyes glistened. She sat, finally, in the nearest chair, her presence a witnessing without comment. She had seen the jacket placed like a small benediction. She had seen the plane on the rug, the envelope at the table, the men circling like planets around an orbit they had neglected. She had seen Arthur's face moving from stone to something softer. Henry folded his hands, searching for the speech he thought appropriate. "Dad," he began, voice measured, "we'll sort everything. We'll make sure the business—" Arthur lifted a hand to stop the machinery of talk. "Not yet," he said. The single word had a demand that was not sharp. It was simply a boundary. "Sit. Stay. Tell me about the boat. Tell me about the knot you learned." It was a strange request for men who had been reared on charts and ledgers, but they sat, awkward like boys in the stern of a small boat. The conversation that followed was clumsy in places, tender in others. Memory, as it often does, became the slow bridge that allowed them to step towards each other. And in that bridge, Arthur saw his error in a way he hadn't allowed himself to see earlier. Suspicion had cost him years of small conversations. He had measured too much and listened too little. It was a painful accounting to make. Still, the test was not complete. Arthur had not yet revealed the full extent of his plan. The envelope remained in view, a symbol of something meant to stir. He had staged a temptation, yes, but he had also arranged other quiet devices, a string of small distractions meant to show character. There were messages waiting to be read, names and ledgers that suggested allegiances, an old photograph in the study that held a story he had kept private. He intended to watch how they treated not only money, but memory, not only convenience, but care. He watched Ethan quietly, like a man noticing an unexpected bloom in a garden he thought he had already planted. He did not yet allow himself to decide. He wanted to be sure his perception was not a trick of longing. When the sons left the study, Henry to take a call in the library, Mark to speak with the house accountant, Ethan to help Mrs. Higgins with tea, the house returned for a moment to the regular rhythm of a place that had held bodies for years. The rain eased into a drizzle. The lamp above the piano lit the same notes as it had decades before. Arthur sat for a long time, the jacket still warm across his shoulders. He traced with a finger that remembered the grooves of a pocket, the edge where a seam had been mended. The lodging of the tattered cloth against his skin stirred something like repentance and something like gratitude. He had meant to see if his sons loved him for himself. He had not counted on the ache that seeing kindness would bring. He closed his eyes, and what came were not numbers or ledgers, but small images from a different ledger, a child's laugh under a storm, a hand that taught how to knot a line, a woman who hummed as she cooked. Remorse settled in, not for his wealth, but for how his wealth had made him forget the currency of presence. He rose slowly, testing his legs, and walked to the window. The rain had left the world washed and bright. Across the courtyard, a figure in a tired jacket was leaning against a car, hands shoved in pockets, watching the house. Ethan's back curved like a man shouldered with responsibility rather than entitlement. Arthur thought of the many times he had missed what was right before him while hunting for larger proofs. That night, as the clock in the hall clicked time like a metronome in a half-timed world, Arthur made a decision he did not yet voice. He would continue the test. He owed it to himself to be certain. But he felt now a softness he had not anticipated, an answering warmth to a small, selfless act. He sat down and allowed himself a small prayer, not to any creed, but to the possibility of repair, that the rest of their meeting might show him what the jacket had shown, an honesty worth having. If nothing else, he wanted to be sure he could look at his sons with truth when the moment came to speak. Upstairs, in a spare room that still smelled faintly of lemon and cedar, the envelope lay untouched. On the rug, the wooden airplane waited, scuffed and patient. The jacket, folded over the armchair like the promise of a small, better world, cooled now with the evening. Outside, the rain began to clear, and as clouds parted, a sliver of moon found the window panes and let the house breathe in silver light. Inside, Arthur closed his eyes and felt the crack in his heart widen into something that might become a new opening, a place where repentance could fit, where forgiveness might later find a seat. When the sons returned the next morning, each would find the house altered in ways they would not expect. The envelope would still be there. The test would proceed. Arthur would watch, listen, and perhaps be surprised again by the measure of a man's heart. For now he sat, and the night kept its counsel. The jacket, the airplane, the envelope, they would all say what they needed in the morning light. He had asked for proof. He had received proof in a small, practical act that had no business breaking him open the way it had. It had cracked something inside, and the sound of that crack was more like an old hinge taking oil than a fatal collapse. He did not yet know what he would do with that knowledge. He only knew that the decision would be harder than he had thought. He wanted to be righteous, to be fair, to be just. He wanted to be honest with himself and with them. And above all, he wanted the courage to do what the jacket had asked of him, to choose what was human over what was convenient. The house slept, but not peacefully.
It slept like a place awake with possibility, an old vessel ready to be repurposed, its foundations cleared for something that might one day be generous in a way money could not buy. Arthur listened to the shifting of his son's breathing in the rooms above and asked himself, simply, if it was too late. Morning would come, men would wake, conversations would resume, and Arthur would carry with him the warmth of a jacket that had been given without condition, a small litmus. He touched the pocket where the airplane had once been, now empty, and felt something like hope or fear, tangled so closely he could not tell them apart. He had planned the test to expose others, but the most exposed thing was himself. He had no appetite for cruelty. He had only an ache for truth. Outside, the dawn was a thin promise, and the Sterling house, with all its paintings and names and ledgered history, waited for the rest of its story to unfold. Morning came in a thin, pale way, seeping through the curtains like a question. The house had the soft, hollow sound of a place that had been filled with voices and now waited to be filled again. Arthur Sterling woke with the jacket still across his shoulders, its fabric cool where Ethan's warmth had been. He kept it there for a while, as if the cloth could sustain the possibility the boy had given him overnight. The sons drifted down in their separate rhythms, Henry with a phone in hand and a calendar already in his voice, Mark with coffee and the business habit of turning everything into a task. Ethan descended last, boots still wet at the hems, hair a little unruly from the rain. He moved around the house as if he belonged there, because in an older, truer sense, he did. Arthur watched them assemble like someone studying a map by touch. He had sharpened this morning into a purpose that felt less like entrapment and more like obligation. He had limited time. Sooner or later he would have to make choices he had avoided his whole life. The jacket on his shoulders was both a comfort and a compass. He did not go back to theatrics. Instead, he called them close and asked for their attention in a way he had rarely asked for anything, honest, vulnerable, and without posture. They gathered near the hearth, where the house still smelled faintly of the tea Mrs. Higgins insisted on brewing early. The light pooled on the floorboards, making every scuffed mark visible, evidence of use and life rather than neglect. "There's something I should tell you," Arthur began, and his voice was steadier than he had expected. "The doctors, they say I haven't much time." Silence folded over them like a hand laid gently on a wound. Henry's fingers tightened around his phone. Mark's mouth made an apologetic shape. Ethan simply stepped closer and took his father's free hand in both of his. Arthur's confession was not dramatic. It was a fact he had to face, and a reason he had called them home.
There was no theater in the moment, only the ordinary hard truth of limitation. "I bought time at the price of trust," he said after a pause, "and that was a mistake." He told them, in fragments and in the plainest terms, why he had staged the small temptation, the envelope, the dimming of the room, the pretended weakness. He told them of betrayals he had not forgiven, and of the loneliness that had calcified into suspicion. He told them how he had come to fear being loved for the wrong reasons, and how that fear had turned him into something he did not like. "So I asked for proof," he said. "I asked to be shown who would come for me and who would come for something else." His eyes drifted to Ethan, and in them there was an admission. He had been looking for a sign that what he had taught mattered more than what he had earned. The sons listened. None of them replied immediately. Henry's jaw worked as if weighing a response in spreadsheets and shared ledgers. Mark's fingers tapped an impatient rhythm. Ethan's silence was not empty. It held the steady, small breathing of a man who had known what it meant to show up without calculation. "You owe me nothing," Arthur continued, and each word felt like a stone pulled from his chest. "But if I have anything left to give, I want it to be used well. I want it to mean something. I want it to be sure the person I left it to would do something with it that wasn't just more accumulation." He had rehearsed how to tell them this, and yet found that rehearsals always unraveled when held up to the particularity of feeling. He watched Henry and Mark, waiting for their faces to change in some recognizable way. Rage, relief, calculation, but time had made them complex. Henry's first instinct was self-defense. Mark looked to find a plan. Both of them, in different ways, had been trained by Arthur to see the world as an array of prospects. Ethan, raised by hands dirtied by honest work, had been trained to see a man in front of him. "I'm sorry," Arthur said then. "I'm sorry I made you part of a test. I thought that if I could see the truth, I would have the courage to leave things as they should be. But I know now, I know I was harsh." There was a smallness in his apology that was close to humility. It did not repair all wounds. It simply offered them to be noticed and named. Mrs. Higgins, who had been standing in the doorway with a tea tray in hand, shifted forward. She had seen many storms in that house and had learned how to hold the center steady. "You did what you thought you had to," she said, not to defend him, but as a fact that might allow them all to move from accusation to conversation. "What we do with what we have now is the real work." Arthur had planned the legal part of his exit as carefully as he had once planned mergers and acquisitions, but he had kept the words simple. He had asked for a lawyer to come and read his instructions aloud so there would be no misunderstandings when the moment arrived. The lawyer came, a neighbor of sorts who had known the family for years, and she entered with the formal calm of someone who handled endings with care. She placed an envelope on the table and unfolded a sheet of paper like a map that would lead them where they had not yet decided to go. She read what Arthur had written, not in legalese, but in plain language. He had divided what remained of his estate into two primary directions, a living legacy of care and a responsibility for those he had trusted to carry it. "The house and the land are to become the sterling foundation," she read, her voice precise and measured. "Its purpose is education and community support in our town and surrounding areas. Mr. Ethan Sterling will be the director and steward of these projects, with the right to appoint a board to oversee operations. The goal is to use the estate to fund schools, repair workshops, and a community center for apprenticeships and small trades." Henry and Mark flinched at that.
It was not that they had expected a windfall, it was that a life spent building an empire had not considered this particular redirection. There was a silence not of peace but of recalibration, old plans reoriented by a new axis. There will be financial support for both Henry and Mark, the lawyer continued, softening the edges of any claim of harshness, sufficient for their families and opportunities to participate in the foundation if they wish, but the majority of the assets are designated for the foundation and for the stewardship of Mr. Ethan Sterling. Arthur's eyes met each son in turn. His gaze lingered on Henry a moment longer, and the look was complicated, like a tally of mistakes and of teachings, of ambition and of loss. "I taught you how to build," he said quietly to Henry. "I did not teach you always how to be present. For that, I am sorry." Henry's reaction was the slow, brittle exhale of someone who had always been told stability would follow. He rose from the chair as if to argue, his voice finding the contours of control he had been taught his whole life. "You can't do this," he said. "You can't just— This house is our name, our legacy. People expect—" Arthur put a palm up, not angrily, but as a shield against the old machinery. "This is my name," he said. "This is my choice. If you want to preserve our name, help make it mean something people can point to without feeling ashamed." Mark, who was more practiced at smoothing things than challenging them, wavered between resentment and a curiously emerging pride at the audacity of such a pledge. The lawyer closed the folder with the firmness of someone finishing a necessary business. There was a moment of honest friction. Henry felt betrayed. Mark felt uncertain about the role he was asked to play that would not be the one he expected. They accused softly, words that did not aim to wound as much as to buy themselves time to digest.
Ethan watched, quiet as ever, speaking only when asked, every syllable tending toward the practical. "If this is what Father wants, we'll make it work. We'll make sure the jobs are good jobs." He spoke of training programs, of fixing roofs, of turning the estate's maintenance staff into teachers who could pass along the trades that had kept neighborhoods intact for generations. "You're asking us to give up a way of thinking," Henry said finally, not without pain. "You're asking us to hand the thing we've been measuring our worth against to someone else." Arthur's face folded into something very old and very tired. "I'm asking you to measure yourself against something else," he answered. "Measure yourselves by what you built when no one was looking. Measure yourselves by whether someone is warm tonight." For a long while, words were inadequate. The lawyer gathered her papers. Mrs. Higgins moved around the room like someone rearranging the air to make space for what had been said. Outside, the light altered with the slow, honest pace of weather. The sons left in silence, each to his own place to think, to nurse a bruise, to consider an invitation they had not been expecting. Henry paced in a library lined with books that had been trophies of a life of acquisition. His anger simmered, and then, in the slow hours, it melted into unease. He flipped through ledgers and called contacts, as if money could still supply answers. In the meantime, images of a father in need and a younger boy's simple jacket returned to him with sharper clarity than any spreadsheet. He found himself remembering a winter when a boy had shivered on a dock, and a hand, plain and uncalculated, had given warmth. Mark went for a run he had not planned, to push his mind into a place where plans made sense. He thought of the procedural ways to build a nonprofit, of the pride that might come from seeing a program actually change someone. He also saw that his own life, superficially comfortable, had been arranged to avoid the hard edges of presence. He found himself for the first time in a long while wondering what it might mean to do work that was not directly profitable, but was necessary. Ethan, meanwhile, went to work the way he had always gone to work, by doing. He spent the day with Mrs. Higgins, helping to fix a shelf in the workshop and teaching a young helper how to plane a board. He did not brandish wisdom, he offered steady labor and a way to do something useful with hands and attention. When he looked up, he saw boys from the neighborhood watching, and he felt, with an odd and unexpected joy, the opening of an idea, that resources could be turned into tools and teachers. That night, Henry returned. He didn't come with lawyers, he came alone, and his steps sounded smaller than the ones he had taken earlier in the week. He found Arthur in the study, staring at the jacket now folded over a lamp, as if it was a relic he could not entirely touch. "I wanted to say I was wrong to be so quick," Henry said, and the words were clumsy but true in the way apologies often are. "I thought the estate would always be a place to keep our name safe, but I was thinking of the name before the man. He stopped, and his throat worked. "I know I failed to notice what matters." Arthur looked up slowly. There was no triumphant smile on his face, only the quiet surprise of someone who had hoped for this and had almost stopped hoping. "It is never too late," he said. "If you want to help, help. Don't help because you feel obliged, help because you choose to be present." Their conversation did not erase the past, but it offered a way forward, one that required humility, reorientation, and time. Mark, too, returned in later days with a different tone. He admitted his initial flinch had been mostly fear of loss, of identity, of the habits that had kept him comfortable. He asked for a chance to learn alongside Ethan, to apply his systems to the foundation in a way that respected its mission. Ethan, in turn, made room in a way that surprised even him. He offered Henry and Mark roles that were meaningful but not controlling, invitations to steward, not command. It was an arrangement that tested each of them in small, steady ways. The real climax, the moment the house would be forever altered, came not with a dramatic pronouncement, but in the daily choreography that followed. Meetings about program curriculum, late nights counting the cost of training materials, the intentional hiring of teachers who could fix a leaky roof and teach a boy how to square a board. Arthur, in the months that followed, watched not from a precipice but from a chair that knew its limit. He grew quieter, yes, but he also grew more engaged in the things he had long neglected. Names, stories, the small scale of people's hurts, and how mending them often required more than money. People began to arrive at the house not with request letters but with hands. Former tradespeople who had been trained in studios now came sometimes for afternoon classes. Children arrived for Saturday lessons in carpentry and bookkeeping, odd pairings that taught prudence alongside craft. The Sterling Foundation, small at first, began to take on the modest ambition of a practical thing, to make skills useful and livelihoods durable. Arthur watched these changes with a shifting chest. There were days when he would walk the hallways and overhear someone teaching the right way to sand a board and feel the edges of a softness he had thought lost. There were evenings when he would sit and listen to laughter that was not performative but ordinary, and it would catch him off guard like a small, unexpected benediction. One autumn afternoon, when the light in the study had a honeyed color, Arthur called his sons and Mrs. Higgins to his side. He had grown smaller in frame but larger in clarity. "I didn't want to pity myself anymore," he admitted.
"I wanted to know how to leave something that fixed what I had broken." "I don't expect absolution," he said to them, "only that we try to be useful with what remains." The transformation was not instant. Trust rebuilt itself the way old beams are replaced, one board at a time, sometimes unevenly, sometimes with a loose nail that needed hammering again. Henry and Mark had to relearn how to let go of certain comforts. Ethan had to learn how to manage money in ways he had never faced. They stumbled, they argued, but the work itself began to bind them in a different way. When Arthur's health eventually made the decision unavoidable, his sons were at his side in a quiet that had both gravity and gratitude. Mrs. Higgins held a hand as if that act alone could keep him present. The lawyer came again, though this time there was no need for public reading. The will had already been announced, and Arthur's spoken wishes had become a guide. He breathed with a rhythm that had been familiar for years, but now clearer in its finite measure. In his last days, Arthur said small things that mattered to him: who should keep an old photograph, which painting should hang in the foundation office, the story of a boy who had once learned to tie a knot beside a dock. He asked them to promise to teach the children who would come through the foundation not only practical skills, but the dignity of showing up. He wanted them to know that wealth without purpose was a poor inheritance, and that his hope was to leave something that could be given away and still make sense. And so, when Arthur died, it was not with a sound of finality, but with the soft, steady closing of a chapter that had been rewritten. He had been broken by betrayal, by loneliness, by the small realization that he had measured too much and listened too little. But that breaking had not shattered him into bitterness. It cracked him open, and from that crack something began to grow. 10 years later, the house no longer announced itself only by its columns and portraits. It announced itself by the sound of hammers on a Saturday morning, by the voices of students learning joinery in a sunlit workshop, and by the hum of a community garden behind the old rose hedge. The Sterling Foundation had settled into the rhythm of daily use. Classrooms filled with apprentices, A repair shop took on orders from neighbors. A scholarship fund helped a few kids into trade schools and apprenticeships they would never have otherwise imagined. Ethan stood in the entryway one afternoon, the wooden airplane he had carried for years tucked beneath his arm like a small, portable history. Children came and went, hands sawdust-stained and bright with new pride. He had learned to keep ledgers with a different aim, not to gather, but to sustain.
He did meetings now with a board that included Henry and Mark. Henry bringing a newfound appetite for stewardship rather than possession, Mark applying systems that made programs run without squeezing the life out of them. Both men had found a place inside an effort larger than themselves, not because Arthur had forced them independence, but because they had chosen it. Mrs. Higgins, older but unbowed, managed the house as if it belonged as much to the town now as to any family. She kept the study as a small museum to memory, a chair with a worn arm where Arthur had sat, a faded photograph framed on a side table, and, folded carefully on a lamp beside the chair, Ethan's jacket. The jacket had been preserved not as relic but as reminder of an act that had pierced a wall and of how small sacrifices had the power to rearrange lives. On an afternoon when the light slanted and made gold of the dust in the air, a boy no more than 8 wandered into the study, drawn by the plane on the shelf. He picked it up with reverence, as if it were both toy and talisman, and turned it in his small hands. Ethan watched him, a smile that carried both memory and instruction. "Want to learn how to carve a nose?" Ethan asked, and the boy nodded with a seriousness that felt like a promise. They worked side by side in the workshop later, and when the new plane came off the bench, it was passed to the boy with the simple blessing of a hand extended. "Take care of it," Ethan said, "and when you can, show someone else how to do it." That was the heart of the legacy, not the size of the trust or the sheen of an old name, but the work of teaching a child to make things that last, to fix what is broken, and to keep something warm for a neighbor in winter. Henry and Mark, in different ways, found that they were less interested in reclaiming the house as a monument and more interested in tending the living parts of it. Henry oversaw sustainable funding partnerships that kept the foundation humble but effective. Mark organized volunteer days and apprentice fairs that connected the town's needs to honest labor. Neither man turned away entirely from the skills they had learned in the old world of deals. They simply found a new vocabulary for applying them. And Mrs. Higgins, who had been the steady hand through it all, sat in the little kitchen during an evening when the house sounded like a place that had been passed through by many hands. She reached across and smoothed the jacket on the chair, as if touching a living thing. "He was always stubborn," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "But he learned the right thing before it was too late." Ethan, watching the room as if measuring its heartbeat, placed a new wooden plane on the shelf where the old one had been. It would not replace the past, it would carry it forward. The plane's nose was carved with the same care, its tail sanded smooth by hands that had learned patience. On the table near Arthur's old chair, a small plaque now read a simple sentence: "What matters is what you do when no one is counting." It had been Arthur's line, accepted by him in the soft days before he died, and it had become the foundation's creed. In the years that followed, the mansion warmed in ways no ledger had predicted. It filled with laughter and instruction, with quiet afternoons of repair, with ovens warm from donated bread, and workshops where daughters and sons learned how to set a joint. It became a place people could point at and say without embarrassment, "That's where we send someone when we want them to learn to make things right." The last image the house left, when the day closed and the porch light blinked on, was small and deliberate. Ethan folding the jacket and placing it back on the lamp beside the chair, as if tucking in an old friend. He paused for a beat and then walked away, the wooden plane tucked under one arm, footsteps steady. Arthur had set out to test his sons with the hunger of a man who feared being used. The test had broken him, not in a way that destroyed him, but in a way that allowed him to be remade. What the youngest did next did not enrich him in coins, it enriched him in truth. It made him brave enough to forgive his own errors, to reassign the shape of his legacy, and to watch that legacy do work he had never expected it to do. In the end, the house that had once been his shield became a workshop for repair, and the man who had pretended to be poor so he might know who loved him best discovered that real wealth had always been simple: small acts done when no one was watching, a jacket offered across a lap, a life given to the service of others. If this moved you, share it with someone who believes in the quiet power of kindness, and subscribe for more stories about how small sacrifices can change the world.